Okay, here we go. Can I just tell you, right? I don't even know why I'm laughing because it's not actually very funny. I'm now an hour into recording this video. I must be on take about 573, something like that. I'm on my third cup of coffee and I've still not recorded a sentence. Well, I will have recorded a sentence now if this take actually manages to lead somewhere. I've got all my notes laid out here, all the arguments that I want to talk about, but I just don't know how to kick it off. Really. So I may as well just dispense with all sense of professionalism and just sort of blart it out and see how it goes on. But what I want to talk about is a claim that has been made that effectively the recent events that have taken place regarding the atheist community of Austin and Stephen Woodford and his video on trans women in sport, which you will probably be familiar with if you're watching this video, and if you're not, I'll try and give you a little bit of primer on that as the video progresses, but that those events that have taken place effectively amount to an Atheism Plus 2.0. And this was a claim that initially I just dismissed as, well, here we go again, because this sort of Atheism Plus has taken on almost a sort of mythical status in people's minds, largely from people who I know from experience, because then when you hear them talk about it, don't really know what that was all about, don't know the details. They've heard about it much more than I actually know about it. But that this is in some ways an Atheism Plus 2.0. It is a claim that initially that I dismissed, but I started to see some similarities, so I wanted to discuss that. Let me just give you a little bit of, I suppose, what you would call a spoiler, which is that ultimately the conclusion that I will arrive at is that it isn't, and I'll try and explain to you this for a specific reason why I think it isn't, and I'll explain that as we get towards the tail end of the video. But there's a number of things that I need to do first. I need to explain to you, give you a little bit of a primer on what Atheism Plus was about, a little bit of a primer on what has taken place here, and then give you some discussion, some analysis, some opinion. And that is what this video is, by the way. It is opinion. I'm not presenting this as some kind of historical document or neutral historical analysis. That is not possible. It's certainly not possible for me. I'm not sure that it's possible for anybody due to the nature of the subjects. In fact, that is the nature of it. If being an historian, which I kind of am in a little amateur sense just for the duration of this video, is that you portray a version of events, a perspective on events, not actual events. Anybody who tries to portray it as something different, I wouldn't really trust, especially with regard to things like this. But I am perhaps in a privileged position here, almost you could say a unique position, in having been around online on YouTube when the whole Atheism Plus thing happened, and probably commenting, analysing and documenting what happened more than anybody else did. And I'll link you to a playlist of my videos on that so you can see that. And they probably actually, those videos provide just about the best documented record of Atheism Plus that we have. Not just because my opinions are on it and my opinions are great, but because I include a lot of screenshots and actually link you to a lot of the stuff that was both on Free Thought blogs at the time, that various different commenters were talking about, but also that was on the Atheism Plus forum, etc., which no longer exists. Okay, so there is that. So I thought that maybe I was in quite of a unique place, given that I was involved in that and that I've took an interest in this, to give you my opinions on this. So that's what I'm going to do. I will be placing this video note on my second channel because it is clear that there are some actors involved in this that would very much like to keep the pot boiling, keep the kettle boiling, chuck another log on the fire, don't really want this to die down, keep the drama going, keep the divisions going, increase the divisions, try and find more and more people that they can purge that simply haven't made the standard, which is one of the similarities to Atheism Plus, as we'll come on to discuss a little bit later. But I don't want to contribute to that. Actually, when Atheism Plus happened, I did, because you could see that things were so sour, that things had gone so bad, that really it didn't look like it had gone over the cliff. It had looked over the brink into the abyss and then tumbled over the edge, and so everything may as well burn. I don't believe that is the case here, as I'll try and explain as we move on. And so I don't really want to contribute to that. I just want to give an opinion piece. So I'll put it on my second channel. And you will note that I'm trying to keep I won't manage to keep the rhetoric and the hyperbole down because that's not in my nature, but I'll try and keep the language down, try and keep the tone down a little bit flatter than perhaps when I usually make these kinds of videos. What I ought to do is I ought to try and describe to you and give you a little bit of background on Atheism Plus, then give you a little bit of a background on what has happened in recent events, and then give you my opinions on some of the similarities between those two things. So I think to try and describe Atheism Plus and to try and give you my perspective on it, I can't just dive in and say, well, Jen McCreight had this blog on Free Thought Blogs and she came up with this idea of Atheism Plus, which was Atheism Plus feminism and humanism, blah, 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 right? Because you need a perspective on that perspective. I need to kind of wind the zoom back so that you can have a look at the bigger perspective. And I think the bigger perspective, and this is how I view it, is that there were 4 spheres to what you would call online atheism. There was the upper echelon sphere, which the sort of Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Daniel Dennett and all these people inhabited, which involved obviously writing books, but then taking part in debates and attending conferences as sort of headline guests. And that was the second sphere, was this conference scene which involved a series of atheist-centric conferences, skeptic conferences, etc., etc. So I suppose you could figure that as sort of existing in the middle. And then you also had these other 2 spheres. You had the YouTube atheist sphere, which I suppose you could say was a somewhat nerdy, sort of really only interested at the time in the arguments that were central to atheism by and large, or where atheism directly related to the societies we live in, where religion is directly impacting on things and just challenging it directly on those things where it impacted. And then there was this blogosphere, particularly with regard to a site called Free Thought Blogs and also one called Skeptic, which was very much allied to it, which had a much more political tone to it, and not a neutral political tone, but very, very much a left-wing, progressive-leaning tone that wanted, it seemed, to tie their politics in to atheism in a way which seemed quite alien to me. But I suppose if you live in the United States and you view Christianity is inherently right-wing and tied to right-wing politics are Christian politics are left-wing politics. Inserted correction, I should have said right-wing politics. Ergo, atheist politics are left-wing politics are atheist politics. I don't know. That is how it came across, and they had quite a different perspective. And all these 3 spheres met within this conference sphere, but other than that, there wasn't, I would say, a great deal of overlap. Then what happened at the time is that the level of overlap increased. Some of the vloggers on YouTube got to know some of the bloggers at some of these conferences, and duly they were invited to start blogs, and that was not an entirely smooth process because I think of a degree of culture clash. But then an individual called Jen McCreight at the same time as that wrote this piece about Atheism Plus, which was to be a new wave of atheism. We'd had the old wave with the Dawkinses and the Dennetts that was all white, middle-class, middle-aged men, and now there was going to be a new wave which included people like Jen McCreight herself, who nobody had fucking heard of other than Jen McCreight's mum and dad, really. But they were going to be the new horsemen and women that were riding into town on this new wave of atheism, which was going to be overtly political. And it led to a very, very large schism and a lot of criticism. And then the claim was that the criticism effectively was unjust because what use is it just to be an atheist? This was the claim. If all you have is these arguments against God, surely you have to believe more things than that, which of course is obviously true. And the counterclaim was, yes, but these things don't need to be conflated with atheism as tagged on as a plus at the end of your atheism any more than they do tagged onto your classic car enthusiasm or anything else. They're not particularly germane to one another, these two things. So this created a really, really big rift, with one side regarding the other as co-opting atheism to these particular political causes, which they objected to, even if they agreed with the causes, and the other half interpreting that effectively as dismissing these causes, as if all an atheist should ever be interested in is the non-existence of God, which is obviously ludicrous. Nobody was suggesting anything of the sort. And as a result of that, positions started to harden. From Jen McCright's initial position, other people chimed on board with that. Bloggers like Greta, Christina, like Richard Carrier, etc., etc. And a movement grew. And as a result of that, it kind of took on two threads. It took on the thread of an idea, which never really took hold, and then a very, very notorious forum, the Atheism Plus forum, which became populated by some very, very hardline individuals. And one of the interesting things about those individuals was that these were people who, if you read about them, and that was easy to do because they enjoyed talking about themselves on the forum, people who suffer from various things that you could regard as underprivileges, that you could regard as hardships, that you could argue as axes upon which society discriminates against them. And I think in most cases it would be hard to argue against that with regard to these individuals. But what was clear is that this forum was an object lesson, that just because you're underprivileged and just because you are discriminated against, that does not preclude you from being a piece of shit, effectively. And what this forum was an ever hardening core of individuals who managed to combine their disprivileges and axes of discrimination with being personally a piece of shit. And in the end, as a result of that, the forum pretty much ate itself. It ate everybody. It ate Matt Dillahunty, and indeed I said that I'm maybe one of the unique individuals to have experienced these two things. In fact, Matt Dillahunty is in perhaps an even more unique position in that he has been savaged on both occasions. Ironically, savaged by the same side, even though he has been deemed to have taken positions of different sides. In terms of the Atheism Plus forum, he went in to try and show everybody that the Atheism Plus forum wasn't this cabal of twats that everybody regarded them as, but was actually rather a lovely group of individuals who were being misrepresented. And what they did is they savaged him. And if you'd like to know more about that, have a look at my video in that playlist called Matt Dillahunty, the Atheism Plus experience, where that is all documented, including the things that they were saying about poor Matt back at the time. And duly he has been savaged again, but this time for not siding with the side that did the savaging, but siding a little bit more with the other side, and so the savaging side has savaged him anyway. It seems that you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, if you're in that kind of position. They ate Greta Christina, who was one of their biggest advocates, who stuck up for the forum, even when the forum was descending into the mire that it became. And then eventually they ate one another and pretty much disappeared up their own arse. There was nobody left. They'd just eaten one another. They'd scared one another off. They could not even tolerate one another's company. They were that hard line. Free thought blogs has gone downhill ever since then. The bloggers that were most actively involved in Atheism Plus left to form a blog called The Orbit. I tell you what I'll do, because you need to see this, I'll show you on screen what The Orbit has become. It is like the blog equivalent of a ghost town. Almost all the blogs on it are dead. The blogs that are still active hardly produce any material. You get about 4 or 5 blog entries a month across the whole blog network. I propose to you, this is the kind of carnage that resulted from Atheism Plus, and maybe why it's worth bringing up, in that not only did it help to crush, or at least the split that resulted from it. I can't just put all the blame on one side, because that would be unfair. There were 2 sides involved in this. But the carnage that resulted from that crushed, I think, a lot of skeptic conferences, crushed, I think, a lot of atheist conferences, and even some of those that remain, such as Skepticon. Well, maybe they got what they wanted with Skepticon. In terms of attendances, the attendance numbers went from very, very high to next to nothing, to rows and rows of empty seats. But they managed to make it a very, very narrow political conference rather than anything to do with skepticism, which is, I think, what this was about.
I know that there are a lot of people in these communities who look to me for guidance, who look to me for inspiration, who look to me for ideas about how to live a life, look to me for some sort of vision. And people don't look to me, to follow in my path. I hope you don't anyway, because I don't want you to do that. What I hope, what I want, and what I think people are doing is look to me for ideas about how to find their own path. I wrote this book. It just came out this year. It's called The Way of the Heathen, and there's this happy cartoon drawing of me confidently going ahead, and there's a path, and there's different paths, because you can take different paths. I got nothing. You know, I don't have a path because I'm just barely standing up. I am barely finding my balance. You know, I've been flattened and I've been climbing my way to my feet, and I'm just, hang on. And I think that's true for a lot of people. I'm trying to put one foot in front of the other every day. I'm trying to say, okay, I don't know what I need to do, but what I need to do is get out of bed and get some breakfast and return my messages. That's what I need to just put one foot in front of the other, and I'm trying to do that. I don't have a path into this new world.
It was an act of effectively political entryism, seeing what was quite a healthy sphere that had people involved in things, which is what was taking place with online atheism at the time, and seeing this as a vehicle to bring their political opinions to another group, even if those political opinions weren't really very welcome by and large, because people did not regard their group as a suitable venue for it, even if they shared the opinions. And as a result, I think they largely killed that off, but largely killed themselves off, because people just got sick to the teeth of being preached at from people that didn't really have anything to say about the central core subjects that they were supposed to be talking about. Go and have a look at that Orbit forum, I would suggest. Click on some of the blogs. One common thread you will see is that of the blog entries that get made, there is almost always no responses to them. It is an absolute ghost town. It's bloggers that have just largely left and just disappeared into nothing, and those that remain are just talking to themselves. I actually, even though I don't like most of the individuals there, find that quite sad, actually, and I mean that quite genuinely. So that's kind of what happened with regard to Atheism Plus. I think that before we discuss the similarities, I need to give you a similar kind of rundown of what has happened with the Stephen Woodford video and the ACA response. So I shall try and keep this section a little briefer than the section on Atheism Plus, because these are more current events, and I'm assuming if you're watching this video, you have some interest in all of this, so have probably been following recent events. But let me try and sketch out what had happened. So there has been in recent times a little bit of an uptick in the interest of the business of trans women in sport. This is an ongoing subject. In fact, if you look at my main channel back in 2016, I made a fairly long video about the IOC's recent, at the time, decision to alter the requirements for trans women to compete in the female/women category within sport. But there had been an uptick in this, including famous people, Martina Navratilova, the multiple-time Wimbledon champion, Paula Radcliffe, still, I believe, the women's world marathon holder, at least in terms of mixed fields, maybe not all women fields, and Dame Kelly Holmes, who's won a couple of gold medals for the UK at the Olympics in middle distance running. So these are significant names within women's sport, have been involved in that. And duly, Stephen Woodford, through the channel of his YouTube channel, had made a video in which he had given his opinions on this. Now, this video had some, I would suggest, this is my opinion, some significant flaws, not least the hyperbole and I would suggest overreaching of the conclusions that he reached. The way that he conflated information, physiological data related to biological males who have not undergone cross-sex hormones with biological males who have undergone cross-sex hormones and are intending to compete in the women/female category within sport, and maybe in terms of some of the clips that he'd chosen to include. There were some problems with the video that he had made, and Julie came in for quite a bit of heat with regard to that. Initially, I think on Twitter especially, he was quite hostile to that, but he obviously reflected on it, became more amenable to it, and Julie said that he was going to go away and try and redress what he had done with a better video that would apologise. He would apologise for some of the bits he'd got wrong, restate the bits that he agreed with, and to try and make a better video. You would have thought it would end there, but not on your Nelly, not in a million years, because some people felt that people were being thrown under buses, right, left and centre, as they always are. The number of bus deaths online is quite legendary, in fact. And so that became a bit of an issue to begin with. But then he featured, he'd taken a trip to the States, he'd featured on the Atheist Experience, which is under the umbrella of the atheist community of Austin. And obviously they had seen his video, but they'd gone on this show. And then after he'd left as a guest, some time had passed, and then they decided to throw him under the bus and to release this statement calling his material transphobic and suggesting that they'd done wrong, that they either shouldn't have really had him as a guest, or if they should have had him on the guest, they should have held his feet to the fire in the way that we're supposed to nowadays with everybody. Even if what we're talking about isn't relevant, we have to talk about the most controversial thing that they've ever said. That's the way it is now. And so they released this statement. Stephen Woodford wasn't happy about it. It seemed that a lot of people weren't happy about it, and a lot of heat then went onto the atheist community of Austin, placing them into a difficult position now. They're now taking heat from both sides, from not doing enough to support the trans community and for treating a guest like a piece of crap, and taking heat from both sides. And in the end, they ended up releasing a second statement, confirming some of what they'd said in the first statement, including their undying, never-ending commitment to the trans community and the trans cause and all this kind of stuff, and inclusivity and all this kind of thing, but withdrawing the comments, the specific rhetoric that his material was transphobic, effectively placing the comment in line with what you would expect from a larger organisation, really. A less politicised piece is effectively what this second response was. And they also, Jamie Boone, who was the president, then appeared on the Non-Sequitor show to be interviewed by the host Kyle and Shannon, and duly in that show, which was over an hour in length, I would say he spent a good 2/3 of that show talking about how on board both he and the ACA are with supporting trans people, and then going on to say how on board he and the ACA are with supporting trans people, and then elaborating and embellishing on how on board he and the ACA are with trans people, and then finishing off just talking about trans people and how on board the ACA and he are with regard to those issues. But duly, that was not regarded as showing enough support to the trans community, and the trans community had now been thrown under the bus, according to some people, by the ACA. You can imagine, I'm not even sure how the bus is managing to move at this point, such as the mountain of bodies that are underneath this bus. The mind boggles. Really, it must have those sort of monster truck tyres to be able to keep running forwards and backwards over all the individuals that were involved. But you can imagine the processes that were taking place, the forces, the internal forces that are involved in the ACA. And duly, more things happened. An election took place. Well, a lot of the moderators resigned because they'd been criticised by the committee. Believe it or not, thrown under the bus was the language that some of them used. An election took place, and a lot of, apparently, the board members of the ACA were thrown off and new ones were installed. So this is kind of the situation as it's taken place. And the suggestion is that and you can tell that this is my opinion on that, right? I'm not giving you a neutral historical perspective, and I know that half the people who watch this video will go, well, I don't quite agree with the way that you're presenting this or the way that you're presenting that, and that is quite okay. We're all going to have a different perspective on that. But the point is that this is being presented as some kind of Atheism 2.0. And so what I want to comment on is the similarities and whether I would regard it as such. So the more that I looked at this, it has to be said, the more that I noticed some of the similarities, but nevertheless there are some fundamental differences, one fundamental difference in particular. But let's just have a little think about the similarities first, other than the obvious one, which is that poor old Matt Dillahunty has ended up tripping over a stone and falling flat on his face somewhere along the line on each occasion. But aside from Matt Dillahunty, and I'm sure he's got broad enough shoulders and thick enough skin to deal with that, but aside from Matt, I think there are some similarities. And one of the similarities, I think, is that in each case there are two aspects to it. It was very clear in terms of Atheism Plus that there were two aspects of it. There was the ideological aspect of effectively, let's use atheism, let's co-opt atheism in the old atheist conference scene and all the enthusiasm around it to drive forward these political, ideological, socio-political beliefs and opinions that we have, even if they are above and beyond really what the remit perhaps of atheist conferences and movements should be about, and even if it does make them somewhat exclusionary and we end up losing a whole slew of people along the way. I don't believe that is the same political, ideological position we're talking about with regard to the ACA. I'm sure it's more narrow focused, and the claim is effectively it's just that, well, we need to prioritise trans people and their rights and them all feeling entirely safe and nobody ever saying anything that they may not like with regard to transgender issues in any of the ACA spaces or shows or anything like that. But it nevertheless is underpinned by the same idea that doesn't matter if we drive a wedge. It doesn't matter if we drive away 90% of people actually who will be enthusiastic about supporting and representing and getting involved with the ACA, because they're not the kind of people we'd want to be associated with anyway. If they've been driven away, all that it shows is that they were ne'er-do-wells. They're the kind of people that we ought to be despising. And I think that aspect of the rhetoric is the same in both cases, even if in the more modern event, the ACA and all of this latest business, it is not overtly a case of forwarding a political agenda as it was with Atheism Plus. But I think we also have this sphere, this online space. And in the case of Atheism Plus, it was the forum, which I talked about. And in case of the ACA, it is the online spaces that the ACA maintains on Facebook and elsewhere, and the conversations that have gone on there. Duly, I am not party to some of them because they are closed groups and I can't look at them, but some of them I can, and I've read the rhetoric and I've read the conversations that's gone on, and a lot of it has some similarities to the earlier days on the Atheism Plus forum. It hasn't descended all the way, it hasn't had the constant purges, and indeed we have this situation where the moderators who clearly were more on board with that, seemingly the kind of people who would have, similar to the kind of people who maybe would have been moderators on the Atheism Plus forum and would have happily gone on that kind of purge, have resigned as moderators. And we've had this situation within the ACA, I'm led to believe, at a larger level, where a series of elections have taken place, and maybe some of those who were most on board with this more exclusive policy, this more hardline policy, have been voted off that board, and more moderate people have been put in lieu of them. Now, that isn't always portrayed in that way. It's portrayed as, again, throwing people under the bus, marginalising already marginalised people, not promoting and uplifting marginalised voices. And if you want to hear that kind of rhetoric, you can go and watch Essence of Thoughts Hangout with Kevin Logan for more of that way of framing it.
Since then, the board has become pretty much homogenous. They used to have several people of color, several LGBT plus people, and a few women on there. Now it's all white guys and a single white woman. That is all the board consists of now. Last night they had some elections, during which one of the questions was, do you support the original statement or the revised statement, which apologized to Woodford? If they supported the revised statement, they were given pretty much a pass. If they supported the original statement, they were dragged over coals for it.
And maybe that's a legitimate way of framing it, but to me, if it's a democratic vote, then I don't know what I don't know what else we're to say about that. I don't know how you want to do it. Maybe give trans members who are particularly on board with this agenda 20 votes each or something to uplift them. I don't know how that would work, but it seems that there are the same kind of things there. Where this seems to be different is that, maybe due to the fact that Free Thought Blogs was already a much, much politically narrower focused group than the ACA, it looked over the edge and fell over the edge. It went to the point of no return, beyond which it could not draw itself back. The momentum gathered, and then it just started shedding off skin after skin of the least devout, getting more and more hardline, more and more puritanical, until even the people that were the defenders of it, the Greta Christinas of this world, realised that what was left was a very, very toxic core. But it didn't seem possible, viewing that from outside and viewing how it worked, that there was any way it was going to ever end up as anything other than that, because it was the kind of scenario, it became the kind of space where that was prioritised above anything else, that was valued amongst anything else. Taking offence was valued and weaponised, and being offended was seen as trumping anything else to such a degree that it didn't seem possible to pull that space back. I don't think that has happened. I think in some ways maybe some at the ACA have looked over that potential precipice and thought this isn't a place where we want to go. We need to pull back from that. And duly, that is how I interpret the steps that the ACA took with regard to the second statement and the interview with Jamie Boone, is that they didn't appear to be throwing anybody under the bus, but trying to be inclusive, but pull back from taking a hardline stance where only the most hardline voices get to have a say, and everybody else just has to kowtow to it and not speak up, because if they do, then they're just going to be vilified for doing so. From my opinion, everything that was said on regard to that second statement that they made, and I will link you to that so you can read it for yourself, or on that interview, which again I will link, seemed entirely reasonable, and they seem to be falling over themselves to show just how on board they are with trans issues. And that is a very, very good thing, by the way. I'm not mocking or criticising them for that. I found it a little bit over the top. They said it more times than I would have deemed need to if it involved me. I'd be like, okay, knock it off. You've made it clear now. But I know some people want to hear it again and again and again and again and again. And duly they did it. And it is true that there is a hardcore for whom that is not enough. There is a hardcore for whom that will never be enough. There's a hardcore for whom they could just talk about that and nothing else. They could make the entire organisation about that and nothing else. And it's still, down the line, there would become a point where that wouldn't be enough. That they don't seem to be able to stop themselves going down that path. And I think that the reason that what has taken place is not Atheism 2.0 is that in this instance, they've looked over the precipice and dragged themselves back to it, to a much more healthy and sustainable position where you acknowledge and look to take account of the rights and positions of marginalized groups, but don't do that to the exclusion of everything else, to the exclusion of everybody else, to focus everything down just in terms of those issues and viewing everything in terms of that lens and that lens alone. It is a curious fact, folks, that being a twat is pretty much an equal opportunities employer. You do not have to be privileged to be a twat. You do not have to be a cis, white, hetero, middle class, middle-aged male, blah, 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 to be a twat. There are a significant number of twats within that group, and a lot of people will happily tell you that I am one of them. You can make that decision for yourself. But what I can tell you is that equality reigns in this. And every group, including the most underprivileged and marginalised groups out there, include their percentage of twats within them. The problem is that when it comes to prejudice and bigotry and self-interest, right, and a lack of concern and empathy for others other than your own issues, it's very easy to call that out. It's very easy to deal with that when it is from a privileged and entitled group. It is much harder to deal with it. And this is something that I've observed time and time again when those kind of individuals themselves are from underprivileged groups, when those kind of individuals themselves are from groups that suffer from degrees of mistreatment. And then you end up in a position where, however much you may take exception to the behaviour or the methods or the rhetoric or any other aspect, it is very, very difficult to deal with those people without starting the claim that the very fact that you're dealing with them is evidence of your transphobia, that you should be uplifting them simply because they are members of this group, and that it's almost as if you are a member of these groups, the sun must shine out of your arse. It could not possibly be that you're a member of these groups and a twat. And I believe that in any space, online or offline, if you get a sufficient concentration of people who are like that, who are underprivileged, people who suffer from prejudice and bigotry within a society and are twats, right, that it becomes almost impossible then to do anything about it, because anything you try and do, however well-intentioned, however reasonable, however justified, will simply be portrayed as an act of bigotry and intolerance on your part, and only taking place because of the statuses which these people can claim, and not because they are, in fact, twats. I think the ACA has drawn themselves back from that situation. I hope they maintain the position that they now hold, including maintaining a a standard of treatment for people who are from all of these marginalised groups, and understanding, appreciating, acknowledging and upholding their rights, but notwithstanding that, continuing to do it within a larger context. Was this Atheism plus 2? No, but maybe it was only that far away. That's all I've got to say on that. Interested to know what your opinions are. Thank you for watching, and bye.